The day the HOA president unveiled her brand new $2 million Marina, champagne flowed, drones filled the sky, and local reporters praised her vision for transforming a quiet mountain lake into a luxury destination. She smiled directly at the man standing at the edge of the crowd, while announcing that his objections had finally been handled. What nobody in that crowd understood was that the lake was never community property to begin with. It existed only because one family allowed it to exist, decade after decade, without asking for anything in return. Buried inside a forgotten agreement signed in 1962 was a single sentence that no lawyer representing the Homeowners Association had ever bothered to read. Less than 24 hours later, every yacht, every dock, and every dream sat abandoned in nothing but cracked, sun-baked mud. The lake sat in a fold of the Montana mountains, ringed by lodgepole, pine, and granite outcrops that turned gold in the late afternoon light. It had not always been there. 70 years earlier, a quiet farmer named Elias Reeves had built a modest earthen dam across a narrow creek bed on his own property, hoping to water his cattle through the dry months of August and September. The creek widened into a pond, and the pond slowly grew into a small private lake that reflected the mountains like a mirror laid flat across the valley floor. The Reeves family never advertised it, never sold tickets to it, and never imagined that anyone beyond their own fence line would ever lay claim to it. By the time his grandson Walter Reeves inherited the land, the lake had become something closer to a living memory than a body of water. Walter was a man in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered and unhurried, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from understanding exactly where he stood in the world. He spent his mornings fishing from a small wooden rowboat, his afternoons tending fruit trees along the northern ridge, and his evenings reading old land surveys by lamplight, not because he expected trouble, but because he respected the paper trail his family had left behind. He was not a man who sought conflict. He simply refused to be moved by people who assumed his silence meant surrender. He had grown up on that same land, learning the shape of the lakebed the way other children learned the streets of a neighborhood, memorizing which coves held trout in the early morning, and which stretches of shoreline flooded first after heavy spring rain. His father had taught him to read a water line the way a sailor reads wind, and his grandfather, before failing health slowed him, had shown him the exact mechanism of the control gate, turning the iron wheel together with small, patient hands guiding larger ones. Walter never forgot the lesson buried inside that ritual, that the lake was not a gift from nature but a structure his family had built and maintained, one that depended entirely on choices made at the base of that dam. He carried that understanding quietly for decades, never boasting about it, never needing to, because the land itself had never once questioned who it belonged to. It was a certainty so old it no longer felt like knowledge at all. Only breath, only habit, only the steady rhythm of a life lived close to the ground that made it possible. Years earlier, a new subdivision had been built along the eastern shoreline, just beyond the property line that Walter's grandfather had drawn with a surveyor's chain and a handshake. The homes were modern, the driveways were wide, and the residents arrived with a very different understanding of what a lake was supposed to be. Leading them, with a confidence that bordered on certainty, was a woman named Linda Prescott, the newly elected president of the Homeowners Association. Linda was sharp, ambitious, and deeply comfortable with authority, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and rearrange its priorities before anyone realized a decision had been made. She had a favorite phrase, one she repeated at every community meeting with the practiced ease of a slogan. "The lake belongs to everyone," she would say, and the residents around her would nod, because it sounded fair, and because nobody had ever asked to see the paperwork behind it. Linda began speaking of the lake not as Walter's land, but as an underused community asset, a phrase that made property sound like a resource waiting to be unlocked. She spoke of a marina, a boat club, a coffee dock built out over the water, a luxury waterfront community that would raise every property value on the eastern shore. The residents, most of whom had never met Walter and knew almost nothing about the dam his grandfather had built, began to believe her completely. By early summer, the Homeowners Association had gathered enough votes to send out an official notice, announcing that construction on the new marina had been approved. Linda had moved into the subdivision only 4 years earlier, transferring from a coastal city where waterfront developments had made fortunes for people who moved quickly and asked few questions. She saw in the quiet mountain lake something she recognized instinctively, an asset undervalued by the very community that surrounded it, and she treated the Homeowners Association presidency not as a volunteer duty, but as a stepping stone toward something larger. She hosted wine evenings for prospective board members, carefully cultivating loyalty among residents who found her energy intoxicating after years of sleepy committee meetings about mailbox colors and fence heights. She had a gift for making people feel included in a vision, even when the vision itself had never been tested against anything as unglamorous as a title search or a county water rights record. Her confidence was not performance, not entirely, because she genuinely believed that ambition alone could smooth over any obstacle that stood between her and the marina she had already begun describing in the past tense, as though it were finished before a single piling had ever touched the water. Within weeks of that announcement, the transformation of the shoreline began in earnest. Linda arranged for a contractor to install a chain-link fence along what she called the community access point, a stretch of shoreline that ran directly across land. Walter's family had walked for 3 generations. Signs went up almost overnight, painted in crisp white letters that read, HOA property, access by permit only. A security guard was hired to patrol the new boundary, and cameras were mounted on cedar posts, blinking red at anyone who approached from the water side. Walter arrived one morning with his fishing rod and a thermos of coffee, only to find a guard blocking the old trail his grandfather had cleared by hand. The guard told him, politely at first, that this was HOA property now, and that fishing required a membership he did not hold. Walter said nothing, turned, and walked back toward his own dock, only to find that a section of it had been quietly dismantled during the fence installation. When he called the HOA office to ask why, Linda herself answered the phone, her voice smooth and rehearsed, explaining that his deed stopped at the shoreline and that everything beyond the waterline belonged to the community trust. She told him this the way a person explains a rule they have never questioned, certain that repetition alone would make it true. Walter listened, thanked her for her time, and hung up the phone with a calm that unsettled her more than any argument could have. Over the following weeks, the changes along the shoreline accelerated in ways that felt almost deliberate in their thoroughness. Contractors extended the chain-link fence further south, cutting directly across a footpath Walter's grandfather had worn into the hillside decades earlier, one that had never required a single sign or gate in all the years it existed. The security guard, a young man named Tyler, who seemed faintly embarrassed by his own instructions, began logging the license plates of any vehicle that approached the shoreline from Walter's side of the property. Linda circulated a memo among residents describing Walter as a long-time holdout resisting the community's collective progress, carefully omitting any mention of who actually held title to the water itself. A few neighbors, encouraged by the memo, began referring to him at community gatherings as difficult, or worse, as someone standing in the way of everyone else's investment. Walter heard the rumors secondhand, through a mail carrier who still respected the old footpath, and he absorbed them the same way he absorbed a change in weather, without complaint, and without any visible intention of changing course. He did not raise his voice, he did not threaten a lawsuit, and he did not post angry letters on the community bulletin board. Instead, he simply said, to no one in particular, that they would see, and then he returned to his fields as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Word spread quickly through the new subdivision that the old landowner had backed down without a fight, and Linda took his silence as confirmation that her plan faced no real resistance. She began scheduling contractor meetings twice a week, walking the shoreline with rolled-up blueprints under her arm, describing floating docks and glass-walled cafes to anyone willing to listen. The residents, hungry for the value her vision promised, began asking when the ribbon cutting would take place. The marina construction moved faster than anyone expected, fueled by an approved budget that eventually climbed past $2 million. Barges arrived carrying prefabricated dock sections, cranes lowered pilings into the lakebed, and a floating cafe with a cedar roof was towed into place near the center of the water. Linda personally selected the paint colors, the signage fonts, and the champagne brand for the opening ceremony, treating every decision as though the entire project were an extension of her own reputation. She hired a public relations firm to invite local news stations, and she arranged for a photographer to capture the moment the first yacht would glide beneath a ribbon stretched between 2 brand-new pilings. By late summer, the marina stood finished, gleaming white against the blue water, looking every bit like the luxury destination she had promised. The opening day arrived under a cloudless sky, the kind of late summer afternoon that made the mountains look painted rather than real. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing aerial footage of yachts arranged in a perfect fan along the new docks, their hulls catching the sunlight in flashes of white and chrome. A live band played near the floating cafe, and waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne flutes, while a local news anchor interviewed Linda beside a bronze plaque bearing her name. She spoke about vision, about community transformation, about turning an overlooked lake into the crown jewel of the region, and the crowd applauded as though she had personally raised the mountains behind her. Walter stood near the edge of the gathering, dressed in the same plain jacket he wore every day, watching the celebration from a distance that felt both physical and deliberate. Linda spotted him almost immediately, and rather than ignoring him, she seemed to relish the opportunity to address him directly in front of the cameras. She raised her glass in his direction and remarked, loudly enough for the nearby reporters to hear, that some people simply lived in the past and refused to embrace progress. The crowd laughed, gently, the way people laugh at a joke they do not fully understand but assume is harmless. Walter did not respond. He simply watched the boats bob gently against the new docks, his expression unreadable, his silence somehow louder than anything Linda had said. A local news anchor, sensing an easy human interest angle, approached Walter near the edge of the parking lot and asked whether he had any comment on the transformation of what she called the community's newest landmark. Walter considered the question for a long moment before answering that the water looked exactly the way it always had, and that he hoped everyone enjoyed the afternoon. The anchor, expecting either bitterness or resignation, seemed almost disappointed by the plainness of his response, and moved on quickly toward more enthusiastic interview subjects near the champagne table. Behind him, children of the new residents ran along the dock in bright life jackets, and somewhere near the floating cafe, a string quartet began playing something bright and orchestral that drifted out over the water. Walter watched it all the way a man watches weather rolling in from a great distance, aware of what was coming long before anyone standing closer to the storm could feel it. As the celebration continued, an older man in a weathered gray suit made his way through the crowd toward Walter, moving with the careful pace of someone whose knees had outlived their patience for hills. His name was Arthur Callahan, a retired attorney who had once handled land disputes for half the ranches in the county, and who had known Walter's father long before Walter was born. Arthur leaned close, his voice low beneath the music, and asked whether anyone from the Homeowners Association had ever bothered to review the original water rights agreement attached to the property. Walter shook his head slowly, watching the yachts glide past the floating cafe. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly, not with worry, but with the quiet anticipation of a man who suspected a storm was still several hours away. That evening, long after the champagne had run dry and the drones had returned to their cases, Arthur Callahan sat across from Walter at the kitchen table inside the old farmhouse, a leather folder open between them. Inside were documents that had not been touched in decades, their edges soft and yellowed, their ink faded but still legible under the lamplight. Arthur explained patiently that the lake had never been a naturally occurring body of water, and that its entire existence depended on a control structure built by Walter's grandfather at the base of the original creek. Attached to the deed, filed quietly with the county recorder's office in 1962, was a riparian rights agreement that spelled out exactly what would happen if that structure were ever altered. Walter listened without interrupting, tracing his finger along the faded signature at the bottom of the page. The agreement described, in the plain legal language of its era, the boundaries of what was then called a diversion channel, a spillway, and a manually operated control gate, all of which sat entirely on land owned by the Reeves family. It stated clearly that the lake existed only through the continued operation of that gate, and that all downstream and lakeside access rights were granted at the sole discretion of the property owner. Most importantly, it contained a single sentence stating that should the landowner choose to close the gate for any reason, all rights of public or communal use over the resulting water surface would terminate immediately and without appeal. Arthur tapped that sentence twice with his finger, letting the silence in the kitchen speak for itself. Walter read it 3 times, slowly, the way a man reads something he has known about his entire life, but never truly needed until now. Arthur explained that this kind of 1962 riparian agreement was common in the region during that era, when small landowners built private reservoirs and wanted absolute clarity about who controlled the water they created. Because the lake had formed entirely from Walter's land and Walter's structure, no amount of homeowners association paperwork could override rights that predated the subdivision by more than 3 decades. The HOA's own legal team, in their rush to approve a marina, had apparently never requested a full title search on the water itself, focusing instead on shoreline access easements that applied only to specific parcels near the new development. It was, Arthur said, an astonishingly common mistake, the kind made by people who assumed a lake simply belonged to whoever built the nicest dock beside it. Walter closed the folder gently and thanked Arthur for driving out so late in the evening. Word of the aging attorney's visit never reached the Homeowners Association, largely because nobody on that side of the lake had any reason to suspect a problem existed. Linda, riding the momentum of the opening ceremony, moved quickly to capitalize on the marina's popularity, expanding membership packages and opening reservations for private boat slips within the first week. She signed a partnership agreement with a regional tourism board, promising guided sunset cruises and a seasonal farmers market to be held on the floating dock every Saturday morning. New residents applied for membership faster than the HOA could process the paperwork, and Linda began discussing plans for a second phase of construction, including a swimming platform and an expanded cafe seating area. The Homeowners Association's total investment climbed well past $2 million, a number Linda repeated proudly at every meeting as proof of her leadership. She commissioned a feature article in a regional lifestyle magazine, posing for photographs on the marina's largest dock with the mountains rising dramatically behind her, describing herself in the interview as the visionary who had finally unlocked the community's greatest untapped resource. She began fielding calls from developers in neighboring counties, curious about replicating her approach elsewhere, and she spoke to them at length about negotiation, persistence, and the importance of moving faster than the doubters around you. At board meetings, she waved away any lingering questions about the legal foundation of the project, insisting that the association's attorney had reviewed everything necessary before construction ever began. That attorney, a younger associate more comfortable with zoning variances than water law, had in fact only reviewed the shoreline access easements applicable to newly platted lots within the subdivision itself. Nobody thought to ask whether those easements had any bearing whatsoever on land the Reeves family had owned since long before the subdivision existed, and Linda, certain of her own momentum, never paused long enough to wonder either. Meanwhile, Walter quietly began a process of his own, one that involved neither confrontation nor public statements of any kind. He filed a formal notice with the State Department of Natural Resources, informing them of his intent to exercise maintenance rights over the control gate, citing structural concerns after decades without inspection. He contacted the county engineer's office directly, requesting a routine safety review of the earthen dam his grandfather had built, a request well within his legal rights as the structure's sole owner. He notified the local water authority in writing, following procedures outlined explicitly in the 1962 agreement that Arthur had shown him. Every step he took was documented, dated, and filed through the proper legal channels, leaving behind a paper trail that would later prove impossible to dispute. Nobody at the Homeowners Association noticed any of it, because nobody thought to look. The morning it happened carried no warning signs at all, no storm clouds gathering over the ridge, no unusual silence among the birds along the shoreline. Walter woke before sunrise, as he did most days, and walked down the familiar path toward the base of the old earthen dam, carrying nothing but a thermos of coffee and a wrench worn smooth from decades of use. He knelt beside the control gate his grandfather had installed generations earlier, inspected the mechanism carefully, and began turning the iron wheel that controlled the flow of water through the spillway. There was no explosion, no dramatic collapse, nothing that would have made for exciting footage on the evening news. It was, in its entirety, the quiet, mechanical act of a man opening a valve on his own property, exactly as the law allowed him to do. The water began to move almost immediately, sliding through the newly opened channel with a low, steady hiss that echoed faintly against the canyon walls. Over the following hours, the lake's surface began its slow retreat, inch by inch, the shoreline creeping outward as the water found its way back into the original creek bed below. By mid-morning, the change was subtle enough that most residents, still asleep or busy with breakfast, had not yet noticed anything unusual at all. By early afternoon, the water level had dropped far enough that the outermost boat slips began tilting at faint, uneven angles, their support pilings suddenly exposed to open air. By late afternoon, the marina that had opened with champagne and drone footage only days earlier had begun visibly leaning toward the center of a shrinking lake. Walter spent that entire day exactly as he spent most others, walking his fence lines, checking the fruit trees along the ridge, and pausing occasionally near the spillway simply to listen to the sound of water finding its old path home. He felt no triumph in the process, no satisfaction in imagining the panic building on the far shore, only a steady sense that something long overdue was finally correcting itself. He ate lunch on his porch as he always did, watching a hawk circle lazily above the ridge, and he did not once walk down to witness the marina's slow collapse in person. Arthur called him once that afternoon, simply to confirm that the county had received proper notification, and Walter assured him that everything had been filed exactly as instructed. There was no celebration in his voice, no bitterness either, only the same quiet certainty he had carried since the day the fence first went up along his family's old footpath. The first person to notice was a teenage employee working the floating cafe, who called out to a coworker that the water beneath the deck looked lower than it had that morning. Within the hour, boat owners arrived at the marina to find their yachts resting at odd angles, hulls scraping gently against mud that had not been visible in weeks. A woman renting a private slip called the HOA office in a panic, insisting that something was seriously wrong with the lake, her voice rising with every sentence. By the time Linda arrived at the shoreline, the docks nearest the shallow end had begun sagging visibly, their support beams straining against pilings sunk into ground that was no longer submerged. She stood at the edge of the parking lot, staring out at the retreating waterline, and for the first time since the ribbon cutting, her confidence faltered. Maintenance staff scrambled toward the marina's control building, checking pumps and filtration systems that had nothing to do with the actual source of the problem. An engineer hired by the HOA inspected the shoreline for signs of a ruptured pipe or a failed retaining wall, finding neither, because the structure causing the drop sat far outside anything the HOA had ever surveyed. Linda called the county emergency line, demanding an explanation, her voice sharp with the particular panic of someone watching a $2 million investment sink into mud in real time. Within the hour, a patrol car arrived, followed shortly by a white pickup truck bearing the seal of the county engineering department. The man who stepped out, a soft-spoken official named Frank Dobbins, carried a thin folder under his arm and wore the calm expression of someone who already suspected what he was about to find. Frank Dobbins walked the length of the shoreline slowly, occasionally kneeling to examine exposed sediment, occasionally glancing toward the ridge where the old earthen dam sat quietly above the retreating water. Linda followed close behind him, insisting that something had clearly malfunctioned, that a pipe must have burst, that this simply could not be happening on the very week her marina had opened. Frank listened patiently, then explained, in the measured tone of a man delivering facts rather than opinions, that there had been no dam failure and no structural rupture anywhere along the shoreline. He told her that his office had, in fact, received formal notice weeks earlier regarding scheduled maintenance on the control gate upstream, filed properly and entirely within legal bounds. Linda stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief in the span of a single breath, insisting that such a thing was simply impossible. Frank opened his folder and laid a single page on the hood of his truck, turning it so Linda could read the heading printed clearly across the top, a 1962 Riparian rights agreement bearing the Reeves family name. He explained, gently but firmly, that the water in question had never belonged to the community in any legal sense, and that the landowner was well within his rights to manage the gate that created the lake in the first place. Linda's voice cracked slightly as she repeated the word impossible, as though saying it again might somehow change the paperwork resting on the hood of the truck. Frank shook his head, his tone unwavering, and told her plainly that the man exercising those rights was, in fact, entirely correct under the law. Behind them, the marina continued its slow collapse into the mud, indifferent to the conversation taking place a few hundred yards away. By the following morning, the transformation of the shoreline was complete, and what had once been a glittering $2 million marina now resembled the aftermath of a drained bathtub stretched across several acres. Yachts sat tilted at awkward angles atop cracked, sun-baked mud, their hulls streaked with algae that had never been meant to see daylight. The floating cafe rested lopsided on the exposed lakebed, its cedar roof casting a long shadow over docks that no longer touched any water at all. A cluster of aerial drones, hired this time by local news stations rather than the HOA's own marketing team, circled overhead capturing footage that would appear on every regional broadcast by that evening. The headline that accompanied the images spread quickly across news outlets throughout the state, describing, with a mixture of disbelief and amusement, a $2 million marina left entirely without water. Reporters arrived by mid-morning, picking their way carefully across the drying mud in borrowed rubber boots, interviewing stranded boat owners who stood beside their tilted vessels with expressions somewhere between disbelief and quiet fury. One retired couple, who had spent nearly $40,000 on a private slip in a small pontoon boat only weeks earlier, described watching their investment settle slowly into cracked earth as though the lake itself had simply changed its mind about the entire arrangement. A local meteorologist, asked to comment on whether unusual weather might explain the sudden drop, clarified on camera that rainfall in the region had actually been slightly above average for the season, ruling out drought as any possible cause. Photographs of the stranded yachts spread rapidly beyond the immediate region, appearing in property and lifestyle publications far outside the state, most captioned with some version of the same dry, incredulous headline. By evening, the story had become less about the marina itself, and more about the astonishing question at its center: how an entire luxury development had been built without anyone confirming who actually controlled the water beneath it. Community message boards throughout the subdivision filled overnight with a mixture of outrage, confusion, and a fair amount of dark laughter at the HOA's expense. Neighbors who had proudly purchased boat memberships only weeks earlier began demanding refunds, while others questioned aloud how such an expensive project had been approved without anyone verifying who actually controlled the water. Several residents recalled Linda's confident dismissal of Walter at the opening ceremony, and the memory of her champagne toast now felt considerably less triumphant in hindsight. A growing number of homeowners called for an emergency meeting, insisting that the board explain exactly how $2 million had been spent building a marina on a lake nobody at the HOA legally controlled. Linda, for the first time in her tenure as president, found herself unable to offer a confident answer to a room full of people who had once trusted her completely. The emergency meeting took place 3 days later inside the community clubhouse. Its folding chairs filled well past capacity, with residents eager for answers. Arthur Callahan attended at Walter's request, arriving with the same worn leather folder he had carried into the farmhouse kitchen weeks earlier, its contents now far more consequential than anyone in the room realized. He stood at the front of the meeting and calmly projected copies of the original 1962 agreement onto a screen, walking the audience through each clause with the patience of a man who had spent his entire career untangling disputes exactly like this one. He showed them the deed history, tracing the Reeves family's ownership back through 3 generations, long before the subdivision or the homeowners association had ever existed. He showed them the water rights language, the spillway diagram, and the county's own acknowledgement that Walter's actions had been entirely lawful from beginning to end. The room grew quieter with every slide, the earlier anger softening into something closer to embarrassment as residents began to understand exactly how far Linda's plans had outpaced any actual legal foundation. Arthur explained that the Homeowners Association had never conducted a formal water rights survey before approving construction, relying instead on assumptions about community ownership that had never been verified by anyone with legal authority to confirm them. He noted, without cruelty but without softening the truth either, that Linda had never read the original 1962 agreement, had never reviewed the deed history, and had never once consulted the man who actually held every relevant right to the water beneath the marina. The board members seated beside her shifted uncomfortably as murmurs spread through the crowd, several residents openly asking why no one had bothered to check something so fundamental before spending millions of dollars. Linda sat rigid in her chair, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the quiet stillness of someone realizing there was no version of this meeting that ended in her favor. Toward the end of the presentation, one longtime resident, an elderly man who had lived in the original farmhouses along the ridge long before the subdivision was built, raised his hand and asked a question that seemed to settle over the room like a held breath. He asked simply why nobody had thought to speak with the Reeves family before breaking ground, given that everyone in the valley had known for generations exactly whose land the water sat upon. Nobody answered him directly, because the honest answer, obvious to everyone present, required no further explanation. Arthur closed his folder gently, thanked the room for their attention, and reminded them, without any hint of triumph in his voice, that the law had simply done what the law was always meant to do, protect the rights of the person who held them, regardless of how loudly anyone else insisted otherwise. Within a week, the Homeowners Association board voted unanimously to remove Linda from her position, citing gross negligence in the approval and execution of the Marina project. The board was left facing a mountain of financial obligations, including contractor bills, legal fees, and the mounting cost of dismantling structures that now sat uselessly atop dry, cracked earth. Residents who had paid for memberships demanded refunds, and several threatened lawsuits against the association itself for failing to perform the most basic due diligence before spending community funds. Local news coverage continued for weeks, revisiting the story from different angles, each report circling back to the same central fact that an entire luxury development had been built on water someone else had every right to remove. Linda largely disappeared from public community events after her removal, her name mentioned less as time passed, though rarely with any warmth when it was. The financial reckoning proved even harsher than most residents initially expected, as the association's insurance provider declined to cover losses, stemming from what its adjusters classified as a foreseeable legal oversight rather than an unforeseen accident. Contractors who had built the marina sent invoices for removal work that nearly equaled the original construction cost, arguing that dismantling waterlogged, sun-cracked structures required specialized equipment far beyond what installation alone had needed. Several board members who had approved the project alongside Linda faced their own scrutiny, with residents demanding to know why no one among them had thought to request a simple title search before authorizing millions of dollars in spending. A handful of homeowners filed formal complaints with the state's Real Estate Oversight Board, alleging that association leadership had failed in its basic fiduciary duty to protect community funds. By the time the dust settled, the total cost of the marina's rise and collapse had climbed well beyond the original $2 million, swollen by legal fees, refunds, and removal contracts that nobody had ever planned to pay. Throughout the entire unraveling, Walter never gave an interview, never issued a public statement, and never appeared eager to comment on the fate of the woman who had once mocked him in front of a crowd. When reporters occasionally found their way to his property, hoping for a quote about vindication or justice, he offered them very little beyond a simple observation delivered without bitterness. He told one local journalist that owning land meant respecting its history, and that people who forgot where water actually came from were often the same people who assumed it would always be there for them. He declined further comment, thanked the reporter for the visit, and returned to his fields, leaving the story to speak for itself in newsprint rather than in his own voice. His silence throughout the entire ordeal, so easily mistaken for weakness months earlier, now read as something closer to quiet, unshakable certainty. Autumn arrived slowly that year, painting the ridgeline in shades of amber and rust as the days grew shorter and the mountain air grew crisp with the promise of coming snow. The dismantling of the marina took most of the season, with contractors hired by the Homeowners Association slowly removing pilings, decking, and the tilted remains of the floating cafe from the exposed lakebed. Walter watched the process from a distance, offering no objection and no assistance, allowing the association to clean up the consequences of decisions made without his knowledge or consent. By the time the last truckload of debris left the property, the shoreline had returned to something resembling its original, undisturbed shape, scarred only faintly by the memory of what had briefly stood there. Rain returned to the valley in early November, gentle at first, then steady, soaking into ground that had been dry for months. Over the following weeks, Walter reopened the control gate his grandfather had installed generations earlier, allowing the creek to once again feed slowly into the basin below. The water rose gradually, filling the lakebed inch by inch, exactly as it had decades before any subdivision existed along its eastern edge. By the time winter's first snowfall dusted the surrounding peaks, the lake had returned to its familiar shape, its surface calm and undisturbed beneath a pale gray sky. Walter built a small wooden dock along the northern shore, modest in size, nothing like the sprawling marina that had briefly occupied the water months earlier. Beside it, he planted a cluster of native shrubs meant to attract nesting waterfowl, quietly turning a portion of the shoreline into a small, informal bird sanctuary. He cleared a narrow walking trail along the water's edge, marked with simple wooden posts rather than fencing or warning signs, and told the few neighbors who asked that they were welcome to use it, provided they asked first and respected the land as they found it. No membership fees were charged, no cameras were installed, and no security guards patrolled the new path, because Walter had never wanted control over the lake in the first place. What he wanted, and what he had always wanted, was simply for people to acknowledge that the water existed because of choices made generations before any of them arrived, choices that deserved recognition rather than assumption. Slowly, cautiously, a handful of residents from the old subdivision began knocking on his door, asking permission to fish from the new dock or walk the quiet trail along the shoreline. Walter granted every request without hesitation, understanding that respect, once offered honestly, tended to be returned in kind. Among those who eventually approached him was a young couple who had purchased one of the newer homes near the eastern shore only months before the marina's collapse, having watched the entire saga unfold from their own front porch. They admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that they had believed every word Linda told them about community ownership, never once thinking to ask whose signature actually secured the water rights beneath their investment. Walter listened without judgment, told them the story of his grandfather and the iron wheel at the base of the dam, and invited them to walk the new trail whenever they liked. Over time, a quiet understanding settled over the subdivision, one built not on legal threats or fences, but on the simple recognition that some things could not be claimed merely by wanting them enough. The Homeowners Association itself was restructured under new leadership within the year, its bylaws rewritten to require independent legal review before any future development near the shoreline, a change residents credited, quietly and without irony, to the lesson the marina had taught them all. By the following summer, the lake had settled into a rhythm that felt, in many ways, closer to what it had been before any marina ever existed, its surface reflecting the mountains in the same unhurried stillness Walter's grandfather had once watched from the very same shore. Aerial footage captured that season showed no yachts, no floating cafes, and no crowded docks, only a quiet expanse of blue water framed by pine trees and drifting clouds. A pair of herons had begun nesting near the shrubs Walter planted, their long legs wading slowly through the shallows each morning as mist rose gently off the surface. Visitors who walked the narrow trail often paused near the small wooden dock, watching the water in silence, understanding, perhaps for the first time, exactly what had been at stake the previous year. The story of the marina lingered in local memory for a long while afterward, retold at dinner tables and county meetings whenever conversations turned toward land disputes or the dangers of assumption. Some people came to believe that money alone was enough to create ownership, that a large enough investment could simply override whatever inconvenient history stood in its way. But the lake itself told a different story, one written not in champagne toasts or drone footage, but in a single overlooked sentence buried inside a modest agreement signed decades before anyone imagined a marina at all. It was a sentence that had waited patiently through generations of quiet ownership, through fences and cameras and confident announcements, until the exact moment it was needed. And when that moment finally arrived, it proved, quietly and without spectacle, that a piece of paper written in 1962 could outlast $2 million in glass, steel, and certainty. Sometimes it is not the loudest voice in the room that shapes the future of a place, but the one who remembers, with patience, exactly what the land has always been.